At my 32nd birthday dinner, surrounded by 50 of my parents' closest friends, my father stopped the music. He slid a blank check across the white tablecloth and looked at me with pure disgust. He told me to pay $80,000 for my brother to start a company, or pack my bags and stop calling them my parents. My mother leaned forward and blew out my birthday candles herself. I did not cry. Instead, I quietly stood up, grabbed my jacket, and said one sentence that completely erased the smug smiles from their faces. 3 weeks later, their massive financial empire collapsed, and my phone would not stop ringing. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your intelligence. My name is Nia. I am 32 years old, and by day I am a forensic accountant specializing in corporate financial fraud. I track dirty money for a living. I am used to dealing with embezzlers and white-collar criminals, but I never expected my biggest case to sit right across from me at my own dining table. Let us go back to that night. The evening started with the illusion of absolute perfection. My parents, Gerald and Vivian, had spared no expense for my birthday party. Our sprawling Atlanta estate was dripping in luxury. The driveway was packed with expensive vehicles. Inside, the massive living room and dining hall were decorated with imported flowers and crystal centerpieces. Waiters in crisp white shirts carried trays of expensive champagne and roasted appetizers. 50 guests filled the room. These were not just any guests. They were the prominent figures of the local Black elite. There were federal judges, renowned surgeons, successful real estate developers, and city council members. My parents had spent their entire adult lives clawing their way into this exclusive social circle, and they never missed an opportunity to show off their supposed wealth. I was sitting at the head of the long mahogany dining table. I wore a custom emerald green silk dress that I bought myself to celebrate a recent promotion at my firm. I really should have known that this extravagant party was never actually about celebrating me. My parents never threw lavish parties for my achievements. I was always the invisible workhorse of the family. I worked multiple jobs to pay my way through college and secure my license as a forensic accountant. Meanwhile, they poured every ounce of their love, attention, and financial resources into my younger brother, Marcus. Marcus was 29 years old and still waiting for his big break. He sat halfway down the table looking incredibly arrogant in a tailored suit that I knew for a fact he could not afford on his own. Next to him was his wife, Chloe. Chloe was a white woman who had perfectly mastered the art of weaponizing her tears to get whatever she wanted from my family. She constantly played the fragile victim, and my parents always rushed to protect her, making sure she never felt uncomfortable. Tonight, Chloe was whispering into Marcus's ear. She kept throwing me these condescending glances. She wore a self-satisfied smirk that told me she knew exactly what was about to happen. She knew a trap had been set. The caterers had just brought out a massive 3-tier chocolate cake. The guests finished singing a loud and joyful rendition of Happy Birthday. The room was buzzing with warmth and laughter. That is exactly when my father decided to strike. Gerald stood up from his seat at the opposite end of the table. He picked up a heavy silver spoon and tapped it against his crystal champagne flute. The sharp, clear sound cut through the lively chatter. All conversation stopped entirely. 50 pairs of eyes immediately turned to him. My father cleared his throat and projected his deep baritone voice across the grand room. "I would like to make a special toast," he announced, smiling warmly at the crowd. "To family, because family is about lifting each other up. Family is about building a legacy together and making sacrifices for the greater good of our bloodline." The guests smiled warmly. They raised their glasses, fully expecting a heartwarming speech about how proud he was of his daughter on her birthday. But the warmth in my father's eyes vanished the moment he turned his gaze to me. He reached into the breast pocket of his tuxedo jacket. He pulled out a leather-bound checkbook and deliberately tore out a blank check. He walked slowly down the length of the long table. The silence in the room grew heavy and uncomfortable as his heavy footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor. He stopped right next to my chair. He slapped the blank piece of paper down onto the table, right next to my birthday cake. Nia, my father said. Nia, my. His tone was no longer warm. It was icy, demanding, and loud enough for every single person in the room to hear clearly. Your brother Marcus has a brilliant tech startup that is ready to launch. He needs capital to get it off the ground. You make a ridiculous amount of money tracking pennies for massive corporations. It is time you finally did your duty for this family. Write an $80,000 check for his company right now, or pack your bags tonight, walk out those doors, and stop calling us your parents. A collective gasp rippled through the grand room. 50 highly respected guests stared at me in absolute shock. Some people awkwardly lowered their champagne glasses. Others shifted uncomfortably in their expensive seats. I looked down at the blank check and then up at my father. He was not joking. He was entirely serious. This was a calculated public extortion. He genuinely thought that by backing me into a corner in front of his wealthy, judgmental country club friends, I would completely crumble. He thought I would be too embarrassed to cause a scene. He expected me to write the check just to save face and avoid a public scandal that would ruin my professional reputation. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of his demand, my mother stepped forward. Vivian always had to have the final word in any family conflict. Her heavy diamond necklace caught the light of the chandelier above us as she moved. She leaned over the table, bringing her face dangerously close to mine. She stared at me with pure, unadulterated contempt. Without saying a single word, she pursed her lips tightly together and blew out my birthday candles herself. Wisps of gray smoke drifted up between us, stinging my eyes. The room fell so quiet that you could hear the antique grandfather clock ticking out in the main hallway. No one breathed. No one moved to intervene. The silence was absolutely deafening. I looked at my parents. They stood tall and proud, crossing their arms. They fully expected me to reach into my purse for a pen. They truly believed they held all the power in this dynamic. They believed their sprawling mansion, their designer clothes, and their social standing gave them the divine right to demand my hard-earned money whenever they saw fit. They viewed me as nothing more than a convenient human bank account to fund their golden child and his manipulative wife. But as a forensic accountant, my entire career revolves around finding the dark truth hidden in the numbers. I knew something that none of those 50 wealthy guests knew. I knew exactly what was hiding behind my parents' polished and perfect veneer. This magnificent estate we were standing in was not a symbol of generational wealth. It was actively drowning in massive debt. My parents had secretly taken out a massive second mortgage just to keep up appearances and fund their luxurious lifestyle. Their luxury cars were leased. Their credit cards were completely maxed out. Their entire empire was nothing but smoke and mirrors designed to fool the exact people sitting in this room. And worse, I knew exactly where that second mortgage money had actually gone. It did not go to a legitimate tech startup. It went straight into a black hole. I did not cry. I did not scream or throw a tantrum. Years of being treated like a second-class citizen in my own family had trained me perfectly for this exact moment. The emotional manipulation simply did not work on me anymore. The panic they expected to see in my eyes was replaced by a cold and calculating calm. I slowly reached out and picked up the blank check. I folded it precisely in half and then in half again. I placed it gently back onto the white tablecloth. Then I calmly stood up, pushed my chair back, and reached for my jacket draped over the seat. As I slipped my arms into the sleeves of my tailored jacket, the deafening silence in the grand dining room was finally broken. It was not my father who spoke next to demand an answer. It was not my mother either. It was Chloe. My brother's wife let out a dramatic, heavy sigh that was perfectly calculated to echo across the entire room. She shifted in her seat, adjusting the neckline of her expensive designer dress before slowly standing up. From my vantage point at the head of the table, I had the perfect view of her face and the face of my brother sitting right beside her. Marcus looked incredibly smug. He leaned back in his dining chair, swirling the expensive vintage champagne in his crystal glass, completely content to let his parents and his wife do his dirty work. He did not have the courage to look me in the eye and ask for the $80,000 himself. He never did. Marcus had spent his entire life hiding behind the skirts of the women in our family, letting them fight his battles and secure his financial bailouts. Chloe, on the other hand, was practically glowing with toxic excitement. This was her absolute favorite game to play. She completely thrived on playing the diplomatic peacemaker while secretly twisting the knife as deeply as possible. She walked a few steps toward me, putting on her absolute best mask of deep sisterly concern. Her eyes widened in mock sympathy, and her voice was dripping with that sweet but incredibly venomous tone she always used when she was about to deliver a massive insult disguised as a compliment. "Come on, Nia," she said, her voice pitched just loud enough for the 50 wealthy guests to hear every single syllable clearly. "There is absolutely no need to be so dramatic and walk out of your own birthday dinner. We are all family here, and family sticks together through thick and thin. You are a highly successful chief accountant making a massive six-figure salary. You have a beautiful penthouse apartment downtown. You buy yourself expensive designer clothes, and you take luxury vacations to Europe every single year. You have so much. Your parents broke their backs for you to give you this amazing life. They sacrificed absolutely everything, their time, their money, their peace of mind, just so you could go to college and become the powerful corporate woman you are today. Now it is simply time for you to give back. It is time for you to help Marcus build our family legacy. $80,000 is nothing but a drop in the bucket to you, but it means absolutely everything to his future." I stood absolutely still, letting her manipulative words hang in the tense air of the dining room. It took every ounce of professional self-control I possessed not to laugh out loud at the sheer absurdity of her completely rewritten history. My parents broke their backs for me. That was without a doubt the most hilarious lie I had ever heard in my entire 32 years of existence. My parents did not pay a single dime toward my college tuition. They never helped me with my rent. They never bought me a reliable car, and they certainly never sacrificed anything for my personal comfort. I took out massive student loans, I worked exhausting double shifts at a local diner, and I clawed my way to the top of my accounting firm completely on my own merit. Meanwhile, my parents had fully funded Marcus through 3 different failed college degrees and 4 completely ridiculous business ventures that all ended in bankruptcy. But Chloe did not care about the actual truth. She only cared about the optics of the situation. She was putting on an award-winning performance for the audience of 50 elite guests who were now nodding along with her deceitful words. I could see the prominent surgeons and federal judges murmuring to each other, clearly agreeing with Chloe. In their eyes, I was the selfish, greedy corporate daughter who refused to help her struggling younger brother achieve the American dream. Chloe had successfully painted me as the ultimate villain, and herself as the noble, supportive wife desperately trying to hold a fractured family together. My mother Vivian shot Chloe a deeply approving look. My father Gerald puffed out his chest, clearly pleased that his daughter-in-law had stepped in to publicly shame me into financial compliance. They all fully expected me to break under the immense pressure. They expected me to lower my head, sit back down in my chair, and pull out my checkbook to buy back their temporary affection. They genuinely thought the social pressure of 50 judgmental stares from the most powerful people in Atlanta would be the final nail in the coffin. They were completely wrong. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice in anger. I did not even try to defend myself against Chloe's ridiculous accusations, because defending yourself to a narcissist is a complete waste of precious time. Instead, I buttoned my jacket with slow, deliberate precision. I picked up my leather clutch from the white tablecloth and made sure my car keys were resting securely in the palm of my hand. The smug, confident smile on Chloe's face began to falter just a fraction. She was highly manipulative, and she could tell something was shifting in the atmosphere. She was an expert at reading emotional distress, and right now I was not giving her the emotional reaction she so desperately craved. I was not angry. I was entirely indifferent, and that absolute lack of emotion terrified her. Marcus finally sat forward in his chair, his arrogant posture stiffening as confusion crossed his face. Even my father took a half step back, his authoritative stance crumbling slightly under my unwavering analytical gaze. I looked directly at Chloe. I let my eyes trace the panicked micro-expressions that were suddenly flitting across her pale face. As a forensic accountant, I do not deal in messy emotions or family drama. I deal in hard, undeniable verified facts. And the financial facts I had uncovered about Marcus's little health tech startup were about to detonate right in the middle of this luxurious dining room. I will gladly leave, I said, my voice dangerously calm and perfectly steady. It carried effortlessly across the completely silent room, cutting through the tension like a freshly sharpened blade. I have absolutely no intention of staying in a house where I am only valued for the available balance in my checking account. I turned my attention away from Chloe and looked at my father, who was still standing next to my chair, clutching that ridiculous blank check. Then I looked at my mother, who was glaring at me from the other side of the ruined birthday cake. I let a small, incredibly cold smile touch the corners of my mouth. But before you sign any checks to fund this grand family legacy, Mom and Dad, you might want to do a little bit of basic corporate paperwork review, I continued, because I already did. 6 months ago, when Marcus first bragged about his revolutionary artificial intelligence company, I got curious. It is an occupational hazard, I suppose. I ran a standard forensic background check on the business entity. I paused deliberately, letting the tension in the room stretch until it was almost unbearable. I shifted my gaze back to Chloe. All the color had instantly drained from her face. Her mouth dropped open slightly, but absolutely no sound came out. She knew exactly what I was going to say, and there was nothing she could do to stop the incoming destruction. You should ask Chloe, I said, raising my voice just enough to ensure the federal judges and real estate developers in the back of the room caught every single syllable of the revelation. You should ask your sweet devoted daughter-in-law why the only managing director listed on Marcus's official limited liability company registration is her own white brother. You should ask her why the tech company does not even possess a basic employer identification number from the federal government. And most importantly, you should ask her why the official business address is registered to a cheap post office box 3 states away instead of a legitimate commercial office. The silence that followed my words was entirely different from the silence that had occurred before. This was not the silence of social shock over my father's public extortion attempt. This was the heavy, suffocating silence of a massive financial scandal being brutally exposed in real time. My father whipped his head around to stare at Marcus. His eyes were wide with sudden, terrifying comprehension. Marcus looked like he was about to physically be sick right onto the expensive table settings. He turned frantically to Chloe, desperately waiting for her to deny the allegations. But Chloe was completely frozen in place. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, looking for any possible escape route. The 50 wealthy guests who had just been silently judging me moments ago were now staring at Chloe with absolute disgust and mounting fury. The prominent figures of the black elite did not take kindly to being played for fools, especially by an outsider who was secretly funneling their community's wealth directly to her own family members. My mother let out a sharp, horrified gasp, clutching her heavy diamond necklace as if she were suddenly struggling to breathe. She took an aggressive step toward Chloe, her perfectly manicured facade finally cracking under the weight of the betrayal. But I did not stick around to watch the inevitable explosion. I had delivered the absolute unvarnished truth, and my work here was completely done. "Happy birthday to me," I whispered, though the room was so incredibly quiet that the words echoed perfectly off the high ceilings. I turned my back on the lavish table, the imported floral arrangements, and the completely fake legacy my parents had aggressively tried to force me to fund. I walked down the long hallway, my heels clicking sharply and rhythmically against the polished hardwood floors. I pushed open the heavy front doors and stepped out into the crisp, cool October night air. Behind me, inside the grand mansion, the shouting finally began. I could hear my father's booming voice and Chloe's desperate shrieks carrying through the thick walls. But I simply got into my car, locked the doors, and drove away, leaving their perfect, fraudulent facade to burn straight to the ground. For the first 48 hours after I drove away from my parents' estate, my phone remained entirely silent. There were no frantic text messages begging for forgiveness. There were no missed calls from my father apologizing for trying to publicly extort me in front of 50 guests, and there was certainly no explanation from my brother Marcus about his fraudulent corporate filings. The silence was not peaceful, however. It was the heavily pressurized silence that always precedes a massive hurricane. I knew my family perfectly. I knew they were spending those first 2 days regrouping, strategizing, and crafting the perfect narrative to protect their fragile social standing. They needed a scapegoat, and I had just officially resigned from the position. On the morning of the third day, I made the deliberate decision to go full and absolute no contact. I blocked my parents' phone numbers. I blocked Marcus and his manipulative wife Chloe. I locked down my personal email and instructed the security desk at my downtown luxury apartment building to deny entry to anyone sharing my last name. I wanted to create an impenetrable fortress of peace around myself. But you cannot simply walk away from a toxic family system without them trying to drag you right back into the mud. If they could not reach me directly, they were going to make sure they destroyed my reputation publicly. It started exactly 21 days into my silent protest. I was sitting alone in the quiet comfort of my living room. The heavy blackout curtains were drawn shut against the bright city lights outside. The only illumination in the room came from the soft, cold glow of the iPad resting in my hands. I swiped the screen to unlock it and immediately saw that my social media notifications were absolutely exploding. Hundreds of tags, direct messages, and mentions were flooding my screen by the second. My mother Vivian had launched a full-scale, highly coordinated smear campaign on Facebook. She did not just write a simple status update. She wrote a sprawling, dramatic, multi-paragraph essay designed specifically to elicit maximum sympathy from the affluent Black community of Atlanta. She titled her post, "A Mother's Broken Heart," and she made sure to tag every single prominent family member, church elder, and country club associate she knew. I read her theatrical words slowly, letting the sheer audacity of her lies wash over me. To my beautiful community, my mother wrote her digital words dripping with manufactured grief. I come to you today with a heavy and devastated spirit. We raised our daughter Nia to respect the sacred bonds of family. We sacrificed our own comfort, we broke our backs, and we gave her every advantage in life so she could succeed in the corporate world. But money changes people. It turns a loving child into a cold, calculating stranger. Yesterday, she turned her back on her only brother in his absolute hour of need. She chose her bank account over her bloodline. She abandoned us when we needed her most, all because she refused to support a brilliant young Black man trying to build a legacy for our future generations. Please pray for her soul. It was a masterful piece of psychological manipulation. She completely omitted the part where my father demanded $80,000 on a blank check at my birthday party. She conveniently left out the part where Chloe's white brother was listed as the sole director of the fraudulent company. Instead, she painted me as a greedy corporate sellout who had betrayed my heritage and my family for the sake of hoarding wealth. The comments section beneath her post was a toxic wasteland of judgment and misplaced righteous indignation. Women who had known me since I was a child were leaving paragraphs of absolute vitriol. They called me a disgrace to the community. They told my mother how incredibly strong she was for enduring such a cruel and heartless daughter. They praised Marcus for being a visionary entrepreneur who was simply misunderstood by his greedy older sister. They were all completely buying into the illusion, but the public shaming was only the first layer of their attack. Since they could not call me directly, my extended family began leaving long, vicious voicemails on my restricted business line. I sat perfectly still on my leather sofa, tapping the screen of my iPad to play the audio files one by one. The first message was from my Aunt Sheila. Her shrill, piercing voice filled the quiet darkness of my living room. "Nia, you are an absolute disgrace." She spat her words laced with absolute disgust. "You have always been a selfish, arrogant little girl. You are the black sheep of this entire family, and you always have been. Who do you think you are walking out on your parents like that? You fix this right now. You always fix Marcus's messes. That is your job in this family. Have you forgotten high school? Have you forgotten when Marcus wrecked your father's car, and you had to work double shifts at that cheap diner to pay for the repairs so he would not get in trouble? We expected you to step up then, and we expect you to step up now. Transfer the money to your brother and go beg your mother for forgiveness before she disowns you completely." I listened to Aunt Sheila's toxic logic without moving a single muscle. Her words were supposed to make me feel guilty, but they only served as a glaring reminder of the blatant favoritism I had endured my entire life. They never saw me as a daughter or a niece. They only saw me as a highly efficient janitor designed specifically to clean up the disastrous consequences of Marcus's extreme incompetence. The next voicemail was from my Uncle Robert. His deep, gravelly voice was tight with masculine authority and deep-seated misogyny. "Naya, listen to me very carefully," he demanded. "A family is a hierarchy. Marcus is the man of the house now. He is trying to build an empire. He is trying to create generational wealth for the family name. You are just a woman making a paycheck. You do not get to disrespect him or your father by asking ridiculous questions about corporate paperwork and business registrations. You are embarrassing us in front of Chloe and her people. You write that check and you do your duty. If you do not, you are dead to me. Do not ever show your face at Thanksgiving again." Message after message played through the speakers of my device. My cousins, my aunts, my uncles, they all echoed the exact same toxic sentiment. They were completely blinded by their devotion to the golden child. They were so desperate to maintain the illusion of a successful, powerful family that they were more than willing to sacrifice my financial stability to keep the lie alive. They genuinely believed that their aggressive words would break my spirit. They thought I would be crying alone in my apartment, completely crushed by the weight of their collective rejection. They could not have been more wrong. I let the final voicemail finish playing. The automated voice informed me that there were no more messages. The heavy silence returned to my living room. I looked down at the iPad resting in my lap. The screen displayed dozens of hateful messages calling me a traitor, a disappointment, and a blood-sucking corporate drone. I did not shed a tear. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt or regret. The emotional manipulation that used to completely paralyze me when I was a teenager simply bounced right off my skin. I reached over and tapped the power button on the iPad, turning the screen completely black. I tossed the expensive device onto the empty cushion beside me, dismissing my entire extended family with one simple flick of my wrist. I stood up from the sofa and walked across the dark room toward my home office setup. I sat down in my heavy, ergonomic desk chair and woke up my massive multi-monitor workstation. The screens flared to life, casting a sharp, bright blue light across my face. I gave a faint, chilling smile. I genuinely did not care about the social media drama. I did not care about my mother's theatrical Facebook posts, or my aunt's screeching voicemails, or my uncle's pathetic threats. Let them talk. Let them type their hateful paragraphs and gather their little digital sympathy points. They were fighting a completely imaginary public relations war on the internet. I was fighting a real war, and I was already holding the nuclear launch codes. I leaned forward and placed my hands on my keyboard. On the glowing screen directly in front of me, there was no social media feed. There were no family group chats or emotional pleas. There was only a highly secure forensic accounting portal displaying a real-time wire transfer trace. I had spent the last 3 weeks digging relentlessly through the encrypted banking data associated with the massive loan my parents had taken out against their estate. My family thought I was hiding in shame. They had no idea I was professionally dismantling their entire financial existence. I traced my fingers slowly across the screen, following the digital breadcrumbs. The $200,000 second mortgage my parents had desperately secured to fund Marcus's fake tech company had not stayed in his accounts for more than 48 hours. I watched the numbers dance across the screen, revealing the undeniable truth. The money had been fragmented into smaller, untraceable amounts. It was a classic money laundering technique, but nothing is truly untraceable to a forensic accountant. The funds had been carefully routed through 3 different shell companies before finally landing in its ultimate destination. My chilling smile grew just a fraction wider as the final banking destination verified on my screen. It was an offshore bank account located in the Cayman Islands, and the sole beneficiary of that heavily shielded offshore account was not Marcus. It was not my father. It was not even Chloe. The account was registered exclusively under the name of Chloe's white brother. My parents were currently online crying about my lack of loyalty and demanding I hand over $80,000. They were entirely oblivious to the terrifying reality that their golden child's manipulative wife had just successfully embezzled $200,000 of their home equity and moved it completely out of federal jurisdiction. The trap had not just been set, it had already violently snapped shut on their own necks. They just did not know it yet. I reached across my heavy oak desk and ran my hand over the thick manila folders stacked high next to my glowing monitors. If there was a documentary camera in the room right now, it would glide slowly over these hundreds of printed pages before pulling focus directly onto my eyes. People hear the word accountant, and they immediately think of boring tax returns or balancing mundane corporate budgets. They picture someone sitting in a gray cubicle, punching numbers into a calculator all day long. But that is absolutely not what I do. I am a forensic accountant. I am a highly trained financial detective. My entire career is built on tearing apart fraudulent empires and hunting down financial ghosts. I track the money that criminals desperately want to keep hidden. I find the invisible threads connecting offshore accounts, shell corporations, and illegal wire transfers. When massive global corporations suspect their top executives of embezzlement, they call me. When high-profile billionaires go through messy divorces and try to hide their offshore assets, their legal teams call me. I am professionally trained to look past the confident smiles, the firm handshakes, and the shiny designer suits to see the hard, undeniable truth written in the banking ledgers. Numbers do not lie. Numbers do not care about your social standing, your skin color, or your fake family legacy. So when my brother Marcus showed up at a family barbecue 6 months ago, bragging loudly about his revolutionary new business venture, my professional instincts instantly kicked in. Marcus stood in my parents' lavish backyard, holding an expensive imported beer and wearing a ridiculously flashy designer watch. He gathered all the aunts and uncles around him to pitch his so-called artificial intelligence health tech startup. He used all the right buzzwords to sound incredibly smart. He talked about machine learning revolutionizing the medical supply chain and disrupting the healthcare industry. My parents looked at him like he was the next great tech billionaire. They beamed with absolute pride while he spun this magnificent tale of future generational wealth. But I was not looking at Marcus. I was watching his wife, Chloe. She was standing just a little too close to him, nodding a little too eagerly at everything he said. Every time Marcus stumbled over a technical question from one of our uncles, Chloe would immediately step in and smoothly redirect the conversation. She played the supportive doting wife perfectly, but I could see the cold calculation in her pale blue eyes. Marcus was the charming black face of the operation, but Chloe was clearly the one pulling the invisible strings. I knew my brother better than anyone. Marcus could barely pass high school algebra, let alone develop an advanced artificial intelligence algorithm for the global healthcare industry. The math simply did not add up, and my gut told me this entire production was a complete scam. That very night, I went back to my apartment and started quietly digging into his new empire. I did not need illegal hacking tools or dramatic spy gadgets to find the truth. Corporate fraud is almost always incredibly lazy. People who steal money are usually deeply arrogant, and they always leave a massive paper trail. I started my investigation with the most basic fundamental requirement for any legitimate business operating in the United States. I searched the federal database for his company employer identification number. An employer identification number is essentially a social security number for a business. You absolutely cannot open a legitimate commercial bank account, hire legal employees, or pay federal taxes without one. It is the absolute bare minimum requirement for a functioning company. I ran the exact name of his highly praised artificial intelligence health tech startup through the proprietary software my accounting firm uses. The search query took less than 10 seconds to complete. The screen flashed a glaring absolute zero. The company did not have an employer identification number. According to the Internal Revenue Service and the federal government, Marcus and his revolutionary tech empire simply did not exist. It was a complete phantom. It was nothing more than a catchy name printed on expensive, glossy business cards to fool our gullible parents. But I did not stop there. I pulled the corporate registration documents filed at the state level. Anyone can register a limited liability company if they pay a small filing fee. I scrolled down the digital document to the section listing the official corporate headquarters. During the family barbecue, Marcus had loudly bragged about securing a prime office space for his massive development team. But the address listed on the official state documents was not a sleek glass building in a technology park. I ran the address through a satellite mapping program and zoomed in on the exact location. It was a dilapidated, run-down strip mall located 3 states away. The official corporate headquarters of this highly touted medical startup was nothing more than a cheap rented post office box sitting between a discount liquor store and a deserted laundromat. The entire business was a carefully constructed paper-thin facade designed to extract investment capital from unsuspecting victims. And the primary victims were my own parents. A fake business still needs real money to operate the illusion. That is when I turned my intense focus to my parents' personal financial records. I knew my father and mother lived way beyond their means to impress the local black elite, but I also knew they had a massive amount of equity tied up in their sprawling Atlanta estate. It took me a few weeks of cross-referencing public property records and complex mortgage filings to find the exact origin of the startup funding. My parents had secretly taken out a massive second mortgage against their beautiful home. They extracted exactly $200,000 in cold, hard cash. They had willingly risked the very roof over their heads to fund Marcus. They completely believed they were investing in a legitimate tech enterprise that would bring absolute prestige and immense wealth to the family name. My father was so thoroughly convinced of Marcus and his fictional genius that he signed the aggressive mortgage paperwork without a single hesitation. In a normal, legitimate business investment, that $200,000 would have been deposited directly into a corporate business checking account to pay for software developers, marketing campaigns, and daily operational expenses. But you have to remember that Marcus and his fake company did not have an employer identification number. That meant they could not legally open a corporate bank account at any financial institution in the country. So the most critical question remained: where did my parents' $200,000 actually go? I spent the next several weeks aggressively tracking that specific cash injection. I followed the digital footprints as the money left my parents' bank and entered a highly complicated maze of temporary holding accounts. Chloe was the one executing the financial transfers. She was incredibly careful, and she clearly thought she was smarter than everyone else in the room. But she was not a forensic accountant. She made one absolutely fatal mistake that unraveled her entire scheme. Instead of keeping the money in traditional banking institutions, where it could be easily tracked, frozen, or seized by federal authorities, she decided to wash the funds. She funneled the entire $200,000 into an unregulated offshore cryptocurrency exchange. Chloe converted my parents' hard-earned home equity into untraceable digital tokens. She did this specifically to completely bypass traditional banking flags and avoid federal oversight. She genuinely thought that because the money was on the blockchain, It was completely invisible to a traditional accountant. She was dead wrong. Using specialized tracing software, I tracked the exact flow of the digital tokens across the blockchain ledger. I watched the money move from the exchange into a highly secure private cryptocurrency wallet. But the absolute most damning piece of evidence was the legal ownership of the digital wallet receiving those stolen funds. The secure cryptocurrency wallet holding my parents' $200,000 was not registered to Marcus. It was not registered to the fake artificial intelligence health tech company. It was registered exclusively under the legal name of Chloe's white brother. The money never touched a company account. It never paid a single software developer. Chloe had successfully used her husband as a clueless puppet to extract $200,000 from his wealthy black parents, and she immediately transferred every single penny of it directly to her own family. My parents were sitting in their heavily mortgaged mansion, completely oblivious to the fact that they had just been brutally robbed blind by their favorite daughter-in-law, and they were about to lose absolutely everything. Exactly 3 weeks into my self-imposed isolation, the absolute reality of their financial ignorance finally caught up with them. The atmosphere in my home office shifted entirely on that Tuesday morning. The warm, golden morning sunlight streaming through my penthouse windows seemed to vanish, replaced by the stark, cold blue light radiating from my multi-monitor workstation. I was sitting at my heavy oak desk reviewing the final transaction logs of Chloe's offshore embezzlement when the silence of my apartment was violently shattered. It started as a single harsh vibration against the solid wood of my desk. I glanced down at my phone. The screen illuminated the dark corner of my workspace, displaying my mother's name in bright, glaring letters. I did not reach for the device. I simply watched the screen light up, flash relentlessly, and then eventually go dark as the call went to voicemail. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee, expecting that to be the end of it. But less than 10 seconds later, the phone began to vibrate again, and then again, and then again. The device began rattling aggressively against the polished oak surface, creating a relentless mechanical buzzing sound that completely filled the quiet room. The sheer intensity of the incoming calls was unprecedented. For 21 consecutive days, my family had completely ignored my existence outside of their theatrical Facebook posts and their hateful digital smear campaigns. They had been entirely content to let me burn at the stake of public opinion. But now the digital notifications were stacking up with terrifying speed. I picked up the vibrating device and stared at the lock screen. The numbers climbing on the notification banner told a story of absolute unprecedented panic. There were 10 missed calls, then 20. Within the span of 45 minutes, my phone had registered exactly 47 missed calls. They were coming from my mother, my father, and the restricted landline of their sprawling Atlanta estate. They were calling back to back with zero hesitation, desperately trying to break through the digital fortress I had built around myself. They had finally hit the invisible tripwire I had been watching for 3 weeks. The trap had officially snapped shut. I swiped my finger across the glass screen and opened my visual voicemail inbox. There were 14 new audio messages. I bypassed the calls from my father and tapped the play button on the first message left by my mother. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair and listened to the absolute destruction of her carefully curated world. My mother, Vivian, was a woman who prided herself on absolute emotional control. She was the undisputed queen of the local country club. She never raised her voice, she never showed weakness, and she always spoke with a slow, measured cadence that was designed to make everyone around her feel incredibly small. But the voice echoing through the speaker of my phone right now was completely unrecognizable. It was not the voice of a confident, wealthy socialite. It was the shrill, terrified shrieking of a woman who was standing on the edge of a massive, bottomless cliff. "Nia, pick up the phone right now," my mother screamed into the receiver. Her voice was cracking wildly, completely devoid of its usual aristocratic polish. "You need to answer me right now. Something is horribly wrong. I was just at the country club hosting the charity luncheon committee and my black card declined. Do you hear me? My card declined in front of the entire board of directors. I called the concierge desk at the bank to yell at them for the ridiculous error, and they told me they could not process any transactions. They told me everything is gone. I listened to the sound of her frantic hyperventilating breaths playing through the digital audio file. She was completely spiraling. They locked us out. Nia, my mother, continued, her voice dissolving into hysterical sobs. The bank sent a certified overnight courier to the house this morning. They froze your father's retirement accounts. They froze our joint savings. They froze the emergency fund. The representative on the phone refused to tell me anything. He just kept reading a generic legal script saying our social security numbers have been flagged for suspicious international activity. How could we have suspicious international activity? We have not left the country in 3 years. You need to call the bank manager and fix this immediately. Answer your phone. The voicemail ended with a sharp click, leaving my home office in total silence once again. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for the woman crying on the audio recording. I felt nothing but the cold, hard satisfaction of absolute justice, playing out exactly as the financial algorithms predicted. As a forensic accountant, I knew exactly what had happened behind the scenes at my parents' financial institution. My parents were completely financially illiterate. They thought money was just numbers printed on a screen that they could access whenever they wanted. They had no idea how the global banking system actually operates. When you take out a massive $200,000 second mortgage against a residential property, the bank expects those funds to be used for home renovations or perhaps deposited into a legitimate domestic business account. But Chloe had taken those freshly minted mortgage funds and immediately pushed them through 3 different anonymous shell companies. She then dumped the entire amount into an unregulated cryptocurrency exchange and transferred the digital assets to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. She executed these transactions using a laptop connected to the wireless internet router inside my parents' own home. In the eyes of the federal banking system and the anti-money laundering algorithms that monitor global financial networks, this was not a failed tech startup investment. This was the exact financial blueprint of a highly sophisticated international money laundering operation and criminal wire fraud. When banking security algorithms detect that level of high-risk activity, they do not just politely decline a credit card transaction. They execute an immediate and total financial lockdown. The algorithms automatically triggered a freeze on every single asset attached to my parents' social security numbers to prevent any further capital flight. The bank seized control of their checking accounts, their savings accounts, and most devastatingly, my father's massive retirement portfolio. They were completely locked out of their own financial existence. They could not buy a gallon of milk, they could not put gas in their leased luxury vehicles, and they certainly could not pay the massive monthly mortgage premium on their lavish Atlanta estate. Their royal facade had completely crumbled overnight, all because they blindly trusted a manipulative white daughter-in-law over their own black daughter who tracked corporate fraud for a living. My phone vibrated aggressively in my hand, jolting me out of my professional analysis. The screen flashed bright blue, illuminating my face in the darkened office. It was an incoming call from my father, Gerald. I let it ring 3 times. I watched his name pulse on the digital display, savoring the profound shift in our power dynamic. For 32 years, this man had demanded my absolute obedience. He had publicly humiliated me at my own birthday dinner. He had thrown a blank check in my face and told me to buy my way back into his family. Now he was calling me with the desperate, frantic energy of a drowning man, begging for a life raft. I pressed the green accept button and lifted the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. I did not offer a polite greeting. I simply waited in total silence, letting the heavy weight of the moment press down on him. The background noise on his end of the line was absolute chaos. I could hear my mother openly weeping in the distance. I could hear the heavy, frantic pacing of my father's expensive leather shoes against the hardwood floors of their mansion. He was breathing heavily, his lungs working overtime to process the massive surge of adrenaline and absolute terror coursing through his veins. Naya, my father, barked into the receiver. His deep baritone voice was incredibly loud, but the arrogant, commanding tone he had used at my birthday party was entirely gone. It was replaced by a raw, desperate panic that he was trying violently to suppress. "I am here," I replied, my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotional warmth. The bank froze everything he demanded, his words rushing out in a frantic, breathless stream. "The retirement accounts, the savings, the credit lines. Everything is completely locked. The branch manager will not even return my phone calls. They are treating me like a common criminal. I do not know what Marcus did with the business money, but the bank is saying our entire portfolio is under federal review." He paused, taking a sharp, ragged breath. When he spoke again, he did not offer an apology for the last 3 weeks of public humiliation. He did not acknowledge the fact that he had effectively disowned me in front of 50 people. Instead, he reverted to the only dynamic he knew how to use with me. He gave me a direct, unyielding order. "You are an accountant." My father commanded, his voice vibrating with absolute desperation and misplaced authority. "You work with these massive financial institutions every single day. You know exactly how to bypass these security holds. Get on your computer, log into the banking portal, and unfreeze our accounts right now." I did not touch my computer mouse. I did not log into any banking portals. I simply sat in my ergonomic chair and listened to the frantic breathing of the man who had publicly disowned me exactly 21 days ago. I took a slow breath and delivered the absolute crushing reality of his situation. "I cannot unfreeze those accounts," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. "I am a forensic accountant. Dad, not a magician. The federal banking algorithms locked your portfolio because the $200,000 you took out of your home equity was instantly routed into an offshore cryptocurrency wallet registered to Chloe's white brother. Your perfect daughter-in-law just stole your entire net worth, and you are currently under investigation for international wire fraud. I suggest you hang up this phone and call your golden boy." I ended the call right then and there. I placed the phone face down on my heavy oak desk. I did not need to be physically present in Marcus's luxury rented condo across town to know exactly how the next few hours were going to violently unfold. The digital paper trail and the police reports I would later review painted a perfectly vivid picture of the absolute destruction Chloe was about to unleash. When my father inevitably called Marcus, screaming about the frozen accounts and the missing funds, the fragile illusion of their perfect marriage shattered in an instant. Marcus had been lounging on his expensive leather sofa, blissfully unaware that the financial guillotine was currently dropping on his family's neck. He confronted Chloe in the center of their pristine modern kitchen. He demanded to know where the startup money had actually gone. He expected her to have a perfectly reasonable explanation. He expected her to soothe his anxiety the way she always did. But Chloe did not coddle him this time. The sweet, supportive wife persona completely evaporated the second she realized the federal banking authorities were actively tracking the money. The financial gig was officially up. She had successfully extracted the wealth from my family, and she had already secured the digital assets in an impenetrable offshore account. She no longer needed Marcus. He was no longer her convenient black puppet. He was suddenly a massive legal liability. Chloe looked at my brother with eyes so incredibly cold and devoid of human empathy that Marcus physically stepped back. She did not scream or argue or attempt to deny the embezzlement. She simply walked over to the kitchen island and picked up her cell phone. She knew exactly how the American justice system operated. She knew the historical and deeply ingrained racial biases that existed in this country. She knew that in any dispute between a crying, fragile white woman and a tall, heavily built black man, the authorities would never bother to ask questions about missing cryptocurrency. They would only see an immediate physical threat. Marcus watched in absolute terrified confusion as Chloe began to violently stage a crime scene right in front of his eyes. Without breaking eye contact with my brother, she reached up and aggressively grabbed the collar of her own expensive silk blouse. With one violent yank, she ripped the fabric straight down the middle, sending expensive buttons flying across the marble kitchen floor. She then reached up and violently dragged her fingernails across her own neck, leaving bright, angry red scratch marks on her pale skin. She deliberately knocked a heavy glass vase off the kitchen counter, letting it shatter into hundreds of jagged pieces across the hardwood floor to create the auditory illusion of a massive physical struggle. Marcus was completely paralyzed by shock. He held his hands up in the air, stepping backward away from the shattered glass. "What are you doing?" he stammered, his voice trembling with a sudden primal terror. "Chloe, stop it. You are acting crazy." Chloe did not respond to him. She simply unlocked her phone and dialed the police. The moment the emergency dispatcher answered the line, Chloe's entire demeanor flipped with terrifying theatrical precision. The cold, calculating embezzler vanished entirely. In her place was a hysterical, hyperventilating victim. "Please help me!" Chloe screamed into the phone, forcing heavy, dramatic sobs from her chest. "He is going crazy. My husband is completely out of control. He is destroying the house and he is threatening to kill me. Please, you have to send someone right now. I am so scared. He is a very large black man, and he is completely enraged. Please hurry before he hurts me." She weaponized her white tears with absolute ruthless efficiency. She intentionally used specific trigger words to escalate the police response, ensuring they would arrive with maximum force. Marcus stood in the kitchen, his mouth hanging open as the sheer evil of her strategy finally registered in his mind. He was not just losing his fake business, he was being actively framed for a violent felony. He tried to speak to try to talk sense into the woman he had loved and defended against our entire family, but the sound of approaching police sirens was already echoing loudly down the busy city street. The response time was incredibly fast. Within less than 4 minutes, heavily armed police officers kicked open the front door of the luxury condo. They rushed into the living room with their weapons drawn and their adrenaline absolutely pumping. They found exactly what Chloe had carefully designed for them to find. The living room was in complete disarray. The expensive vase was shattered across the floor. Chloe was cowering in the corner of the kitchen, crying hysterically and clutching her torn silk blouse. And standing in the center of the room was Marcus, looking like a towering, terrified suspect. The officers did not ask Marcus for his side of the story. They did not sit down to have a calm, rational discussion about corporate bank accounts or offshore wire transfers. The visual optics were already completely set in stone. They saw a weeping white woman with scratch marks on her neck, and they immediately perceived my brother as a violent aggressor. "Get on the ground right now," an officer screamed, pointing his weapon directly at Marcus's chest. "Do not move your hands. Get on the ground." Marcus tried to desperately explain. He tried to tell them about the missing money and the fake startup, but his frantic, panicked words only made the officers more aggressive. 2 officers charged forward, tackling my brother aggressively onto the shattered glass. They drove their heavy knees into his back and violently wrenched his arms behind him. The loud metallic clicking of heavy police handcuffs echoed through the luxury apartment, completely drowning out Marcus's desperate pleas for someone to just look at the financial records. Chloe continued her award-winning performance, crying into the shoulder of a female officer who was gently wrapping a warm blanket around her trembling shoulders. The female officer glared at Marcus with absolute disgust, treating him exactly like the violent monster Chloe had painted him to be. They hauled my brother roughly to his feet. They marched him out of his own apartment building in handcuffs, completely humiliating him in front of all his wealthy neighbors who were peeking out of their doorways to watch the spectacular downfall. Marcus was shoved into the back of a cold police cruiser. As the heavy metal door slammed shut, he caught one final glimpse of his wife standing in the lobby of their expensive building. The tears had completely stopped. Chloe was looking directly at him through the thick glass doors, and she was wearing that exact same smug, arrogant smirk she had worn at my birthday party. She had played the ultimate trump card, and she had won absolutely everything. With Marcus locked inside a holding cell, facing incredibly serious domestic violence charges, Chloe was completely free to execute the final phase of her grand exit strategy. She calmly walked back upstairs to the empty apartment. She did not bother packing any large suitcases or moving any heavy furniture. She did not care about the expensive leather sofas or the designer clothing. All she cared about was the small encrypted digital ledger resting inside her purse. She possessed the digital keys to 200,000 untraceable dollars. She walked out the front door, hailed a private car service, and vanished completely into the wind. Back at the sprawling Atlanta estate, my parents were completely oblivious to the violent arrest of their precious golden boy. They were still sitting at their massive dining room table, frantically dialing the customer service line of their frozen bank. They were desperately trying to find a way to access money that simply did not exist anymore. But their problems were only just beginning to multiply. The $200,000 they had pulled from their home equity was a massive high-interest loan, and the very first payment was currently 2 weeks past due. Because the bank had locked their entire financial portfolio pending a federal fraud investigation, they had absolutely no liquid cash to cover the rapidly accelerating penalties. The very next afternoon, a specialized courier drove up their long, manicured driveway. He did not bring apologies from the bank manager. He marched straight up to the heavy front doors and slapped a brightly colored legal document directly onto the expensive wood. It was a formal notice of default and impending property foreclosure. The bank was officially seizing the mansion. The fake generational wealth had completely evaporated. The golden child was sitting in a county jail cell. The manipulative daughter-in-law was gone with all the money, and my parents were suddenly staring down the barrel of absolute catastrophic financial ruin with absolutely nowhere left to turn. I sat perfectly still in the dim lighting of my home office, holding a heavy crystal tumbler of aged bourbon. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the sharp burn of the alcohol ground me in the present moment. The chaos unfolding across the city, at my parents' estate and my brother's luxury condo, felt like a distant movie I was simply watching on a screen. I had spent my entire life being dragged into their emotional tornadoes. But tonight, I was sitting safely inside a fortress of my own making. My phone had been resting face down on the polished oak desk since I abruptly hung up on my father. For about 20 minutes, the room was entirely silent. Then the device began to vibrate once again, sliding slightly across the smooth wood. I picked up the phone and looked at the glowing caller identification. It was not my father this time. It was my mother, Vivian. I swiped the screen to accept the call and brought the phone to my ear. I did not say a word. I simply waited. The sound that greeted me was not the sharp, condescending tone my mother had used for the last 3 decades. It was the sound of a woman completely and utterly broken. Vivian was weeping with a raw, guttural intensity that I had never heard from her before. She was gasping for air, her words stumbling over each other in a frantic, terrified rush. The aristocratic facade, the country club poise, and the arrogant superiority had all been completely stripped away, leaving behind nothing but pure panic. Nia, my mother, sobbed, her voice trembling so violently I could barely make out the syllables. "Nia, please talk to me. You have to help us. Everything is gone. It is all completely gone. The bank is taking the house. They put a foreclosure notice right on the front door. Your father is sitting in the living room holding his chest, and I do not know what to do." She paused to take a ragged, hyperventilating breath. I took another slow sip of my bourbon, the ice clinking softly against the heavy glass. I let her continue to unravel. And Marcus, my mother wailed, the sound of my brother's name triggering a fresh wave of hysterical crying. The police took him, Nia. They arrested him. Chloe called them and told them he was attacking her. She ripped her own clothes and faked a crime scene. They took him out of his building in handcuffs in front of everyone. He is sitting in a county jail cell right now facing felony domestic violence charges, and we cannot even post his bail because the bank locked every single account we have. Chloe took the money. She took all of it and she disappeared. You were right, Nia. You were right about her all along. It was the very first time in my 32 years of existence that my mother had ever admitted I was right about anything. But there was no genuine accountability in her voice. There was no real apology for the horrific way she had treated me. She was only acknowledging my intelligence now because she desperately needed to weaponize it for her own survival. She quickly shifted gears, moving seamlessly from playing the victim to deploying the absolute heaviest emotional manipulation she possessed. She pulled the ultimate trump card that toxic families always use when they have completely run out of leverage. She played the family blood card. "You are his big sister," my mother pleaded, her tone shifting into a desperate, demanding whine. "Blood is thicker than water, Nia. You have to come down here right now. You are the only one in the family who understands how this financial and legal system works. You have the money. You have those high-level connections at your accounting firm. You need to hire the best criminal defense attorney in Atlanta to get your brother out of that jail cell before they ruin his entire life. And you need to call the bank manager. You have to explain to them that this is all a massive misunderstanding, so they will unfreeze our retirement funds." I listened to her list of demands with a profound sense of detachment. It was truly breathtaking to witness her absolute delusion in real time. Exactly 3 weeks ago, this exact same woman had leaned over a dining table and maliciously blown out my birthday candles. She had stood by proudly while my father demanded I hand over $80,000 or forfeit my place in the family. She had spent the last 21 days destroying my character on social media, turning my extended relatives against me, and branding me a disgraceful traitor to my own bloodline. Yet the very second their golden child was in handcuffs and their fake wealth was exposed, she fully expected me to instantly forget all the abuse. She expected me to swoop in, liquidate my own hard-earned assets, and act as their ultimate savior. She genuinely believed that the biological accident of our shared DNA obligated me to sacrifice my own peace to clean up their catastrophic failures. "Mom," I said, my voice completely steady, cutting through her hysterical sobbing like a knife. "Do you remember what you told me at my birthday party? You and Dad made it very clear that family is about building a legacy together. You told me that I was a cold, calculating stranger because I refused to fund Marcus and his brilliant business ventures. Nia, please do not do this right now," my mother cried desperately, trying to deflect the undeniable truth of her past actions. "We were just stressed. We were just trying to help your brother succeed. We are a family. We are Black people in a system designed to see us fail, and we have to stick together. You cannot abandon your own flesh and blood when he is locked in a cage. You cannot let them take your childhood home. I carried you for 9 months. I raised you. You owe us your loyalty." I slowly lowered my crystal tumbler to the desk. The sheer audacity of her demanding loyalty after completely discarding me was almost fascinating. She was trying to weaponize our racial identity, our family history, and her status as my mother all at once. But none of those emotional hooks had any power over me anymore. I had severed those invisible strings the night I walked out of their mansion. "I do not owe you anything," I replied, my tone dropping into a cold clinical register. "I am a forensic accountant, Mom. I deal in ledgers, contracts, and verified transactions. You and Dad made a transaction at my birthday dinner. You officially traded your daughter for the illusion of a wealthy son. You chose to trust a white woman who smiled in your face while actively embezzling $200,000 of your home equity. You chose to sign those mortgage papers without reading them. You made your investments, and now you are simply experiencing the absolute bankruptcy of those choices." You cannot say that my mother screamed, her voice cracking under the intense pressure of her crumbling reality. "You are punishing us. You are sitting in your fancy downtown apartment punishing us because your feelings were hurt. But this is not a game, Nia. The bank thinks we are criminals. They think we stole that money. If we do not unfreeze those accounts and pay the mortgage, the bank is going to auction off this house in less than 30 days. You have to call them. You have to tell them we are innocent victims. You have to unfreeze the money." I took a deep breath, letting the silence stretch between us for 5 long, agonizing seconds. I wanted her to hear the absolute finality in the air before I delivered the ultimate killing blow. I wanted her to understand exactly who she was dealing with. She still thought I was the obedient little girl who would eventually cave under the weight of her tears. She had no idea she was speaking to the architect of her entire destruction. "I can't unfreeze them, Mom," I said, my voice perfectly calm, echoing slightly in the quiet of my office. "Why not?" she sobbed frantically. "You are a senior partner. You know the banking executives. You can make them understand." "I cannot unfreeze your accounts," I repeated, pronouncing every single word with deliberate, terrifying clarity. "Because the bank did not flag your portfolio by accident. The algorithms did not just randomly decide to lock your money. They locked your accounts because someone handed them a massive, fully documented file outlining exactly how those funds were moved offshore. Someone traced the cryptocurrency transfers, identified the anonymous shell companies, and proved that the money landed in a wallet controlled by Chloe's brother." The frantic sobbing on the other end of the line abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating as the horrifying reality of my words slowly began to register in her panicking brain. "I can't unfreeze your accounts, Mom," I concluded, delivering the final absolute truth. "Because the person who submitted that massive file of wire fraud evidence directly to the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation was me." I ended the call right then and there. I placed the phone face down on my heavy oak desk and listened to the profound silence of my apartment. My mother was likely still sitting on the floor of her sprawling mansion, staring at a dead line, completely unable to process the magnitude of the betrayal. I had just handed her the absolute truth. I was the architect of their financial lockdown. But a forensic accountant knows that submitting the evidence is only half the battle. You have to be present when the final audit is delivered. I stood up from my ergonomic chair, walked over to my personal safe, and pulled out a massive stack of heavily documented files. I placed them carefully into my thick leather briefcase, snapped the heavy brass locks shut, and headed for the door. It was time to return to the scene of the crime. The drive from my downtown penthouse to my parents' affluent suburban neighborhood took exactly 45 minutes. If you were watching this play out through the lens of a documentary camera, this is exactly where the visual tone of the story would completely shift. The camera would start with a slow, steady tracking shot following directly behind me as I stepped out of my car. You would hear the sharp, rhythmic clicking of my heels against the pristine concrete driveway. You would see the massive, towering columns of my parents' brick colonial mansion looming in the distance. But the house no longer looked like a fortress of generational wealth. It looked like a tomb. As I walked up the long, winding path toward the grand entrance, the illusion of their high society status was being publicly dismantled in broad daylight. Two men wearing cheap gray suits and holding thick clipboards were standing on the front porch. They were official representatives from the bank. One of them was holding a roll of heavy industrial tape, while the other smoothed a bright neon yellow piece of paper directly onto the expensive mahogany front door. It was a formal notice of foreclosure and property seizure. The notice was large, glaring, and impossible to miss. Every single wealthy neighbor driving past the estate would see exactly what was happening. The fake royalty of the neighborhood was officially being dethroned. I did not say a word to the bank representatives. I simply walked past them, pushed open the heavy, unlatched front doors, and stepped into the massive foyer. The contrast between my 32nd birthday party and this exact moment was absolutely staggering. 3 weeks ago, this house was filled with the intoxicating scent of expensive perfume, imported flowers, and catered delicacies. It was vibrating with the loud, arrogant laughter of 50 elite guests. Today, the air inside the mansion was stale, suffocating, and completely devoid of life. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn shut, blocking out the afternoon sun and casting the grand living room in a cold, gloomy shadow. My father Gerald was pacing frantically back and forth across the expensive Persian rug. His usually crisp designer shirt was wrinkled and untucked. He was aggressively rubbing his temples, his face completely gray with exhaustion and terror. My mother, Vivian, was sitting collapsed on the edge of the plush sofa. She was staring blankly at the floor, her perfectly styled hair now a tangled mess. She looked like she had aged 10 years in the span of a single afternoon. When they heard my footsteps echoing across the marble floor, they both snapped their heads up. For a brief fleeting second, I saw a spark of desperate hope ignite in their eyes. They saw their highly successful daughter walking through the door with a briefcase, and their deeply ingrained arrogance tricked them into believing I was there to save them. They genuinely thought I had come to fix the mess, to pay the mortgage, and to somehow make the federal investigation disappear. Before either of them could even open their mouths to speak, the heavy wooden front doors swung open again. The sound of the heavy brass hinges groaning echoed sharply through the silent house. I turned around and watched as the nightmare my parents had inadvertently invited into their home walked right through the front door. It was Chloe. She was not running away from the wreckage. She was returning to the scene of the crime to ensure her absolute victory. She had changed out of the torn silk blouse she used to frame my brother. She was now wearing a sleek, immaculate white designer suit, looking entirely unbothered by the fact that she had just destroyed an entire family. But she did not come alone. Walking confidently right beside her was a tall, impeccably dressed older white man holding an expensive leather folio. He carried himself with the specific type of smug, terrifying arrogance that only comes from decades of navigating the legal system with absolute impunity. He surveyed the gloomy living room, looking at my parents with thinly veiled disgust, as if he had just stepped into something incredibly unpleasant on the bottom of his shoe. "Gerald," my father choked out, his voice trembling as he took a step toward his daughter-in-law. "How could you do this? Where is the money, Chloe? Where is my son?" Chloe did not even blink. She did not cower or apologize. She simply stood perfectly still and let a slow, condescending smirk spread across her pale face. She gestured lazily to the man standing next to her. "Gerald, Vivian, Chloe," said, her voice dripping with toxic sweetness. "I would like to introduce you to my legal counsel, Mr. Harrison. I brought him here today to help clarify the unfortunate legal realities of your current financial situation. I think there has been a massive misunderstanding about who is actually responsible for this mess." The lawyer stepped forward, completely blocking Chloe from my father's view. He unbuttoned his suit jacket with a smooth, practiced motion and looked directly at my father. His voice was incredibly smooth, heavily polished, and laced with razor-sharp legal threats. "Mr. and Mrs. Wilson." The lawyer began, his tone patronizing and deeply dismissive. "Let us dispense with the emotional theatrics and stick to the documented facts. My client, Chloe, is currently the victim of a vicious domestic assault perpetrated by your son. She is deeply traumatized. However, she is willing to be incredibly generous today regarding your financial complaints. You are currently under the impression that my client stole your money. That is a very dangerous and legally actionable accusation." My father looked like he was about to physically explode. He balled his hands into tight fists. "She took $200,000 of my home equity," he shouted, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "She wired it offshore. She ruined my family." The lawyer did not even flinch. He simply opened his leather folio and pulled out a single sheet of paper, holding it up for my parents to see. "I strongly advise you to lower your voice, Mr. Wilson," the lawyer warned, his eyes narrowing with aggressive intent. "Because the legal documents tell a very different story. Your son Marcus was the sole authorized managing director of the corporate entity that received your investment funds. He is the one who signed the primary authorization forms. He is the one who legally authorized the conversion of those funds into digital assets, and his signature is on the executed smart contracts transferring those assets out of the country." The lawyer paused, letting the horrifying weight of his words sink deep into my parents' minds. My client was simply acting under the direct administrative orders of her husband. The lawyer continued, spinning a flawless legal web. "If you go to the federal authorities and officially report those funds as stolen, You will not be sending my client to prison. You will be handing the Federal Bureau of Investigation a perfectly documented case of corporate embezzlement against your own son. Marcus is already sitting in a county jail cell facing violent felony charges. If you push this financial issue, you will trigger a federal indictment. He will be transferred to a federal penitentiary and he will face a minimum of 20 years for domestic wire fraud. The room went completely dead. The silence was absolute and suffocating. The brilliant legal trap had been fully sprung. Chloe had not just stolen their money. She had expertly weaponized Marcus's complete incompetence against him. She had spent months buttering him up, inflating his massive ego, and convincing him to eagerly sign hundreds of corporate documents he never bothered to actually read. She had legally constructed the entire offshore transfer so that Marcus's digital signature authorized every single transaction. On paper, in the eyes of the law, Marcus was the mastermind who had defrauded his own parents, and Chloe was just the innocent wife following his misguided business directives. So here's the deal, the lawyer said, snapping his leather folio shut with a loud, sharp crack. My client will not press for maximum sentencing on the domestic violence charges if you agree to drop all inquiries into the corporate funds. You sign a non-disclosure agreement, you accept the loss of the residential property, and you keep your mouths entirely shut. If you try to sue my client or drag her name through the mud, we will hand Marcus's signed financial authorizations directly to the federal prosecutor. You choose right now. You can lose your house or you can send your son to federal prison for the rest of his natural life. My parents were completely paralyzed. The arrogant, powerful facade they had spent decades building was utterly obliterated in a matter of seconds. My father's knees literally buckled, causing him to collapse heavily into a velvet armchair. He covered his face with his trembling hands, completely broken. My mother let out a quiet, whimpering sound, her spirit completely crushed under the weight of the impossible choice. They were checkmated. A smug white lawyer had just walked into their home and legally blackmailed them into absolute submission, using their own golden child as the ultimate bargaining chip. Chloe peeked out from behind her lawyer's shoulder. She looked at my devastated parents, and then she looked directly at me, standing quietly in the shadows of the grand foyer. Her blue eyes were shining with absolute malicious triumph. She truly believed she was the smartest person in the room. She believed her highly paid legal bulldog had just secured her immunity, and she was going to walk away with $200,000 completely unscathed. She was wrong. I did not cower. I did not cry for my parents. I stepped out of the shadows and walked slowly, deliberately toward the center of the living room. Every single eye in the room turned to me. The tracking camera would follow my steady steps, capturing the cold, absolute lack of fear on my face. I stopped right in front of the lawyer. I looked him dead in the eye, completely ignoring his aggressive posture. Without saying a single word, I lifted my heavy leather briefcase and slammed it down onto the center of the glass coffee table. The massive impact echoed like a gunshot through the silent mansion, violently shattering the lawyer's smug illusion of control. The heavy brass locks on my briefcase clicked sharply in the silent room. Mr. Harrison, the impeccably dressed lawyer, blinked in surprise at the sudden physical intrusion. His arrogant posture faltered for just a fraction of a second before he quickly recovered. He adjusted the lapels of his expensive suit and glared at me with the practiced condescension of a man who was used to dominating every room he entered. He looked me up and down, taking in my tailored outfit and unimpressed expression, before turning his attention back to Chloe. "Who exactly is this?" he demanded, his tone dripping with intense annoyance. "I specifically advised you that we would only be dealing with the homeowners today. We do not need any additional emotional interference from extended relatives while we are finalizing these legal agreements." Chloe rolled her eyes and let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "That is just Nia," she sneered, crossing her arms tightly over her designer suit. "She is Marcus's bitter older sister. She has not spoken to the family in almost a month because she was too incredibly selfish to help fund the business. You can just completely ignore her, Mr. Harrison. She just likes to make grand dramatic entrances because she is intensely jealous of my success." Mr. Harrison turned back to me, letting out a patronizing sigh. He looked at my leather briefcase resting on the glass table as if it were a cheap child's toy. "Listen to me very carefully, young lady," he said, stepping forward and using his physical height to try and intimidate me. "I understand that you are upset about your family's current financial disaster. I am sure it is very painful to watch your childhood home slide into foreclosure. But you have absolutely no legal standing in this room. You are not a party to the mortgage contract. You are not a registered shareholder in the corporate entity. This is a private marital and financial dispute between my client, your brother, and the banking institution. If you interfere with my client's legal negotiations, I will personally have you removed for trespassing and slap you with a harassment lawsuit before you even reach the end of the driveway. Now be a good girl, pick up your little briefcase, and run along." The extreme slow push and camera shot would begin right here, slowly creeping closer to our faces as the tension in the room escalated into a suffocating battle of wits. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I matched his arrogant stare with the cold, dead-eyed gaze of someone who had spent their entire professional career destroying men exactly like him. I placed my hands flat against the top of my leather briefcase. "I am not here as a concerned sister, Mr. Harrison," I replied, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotional wavering. "I am a senior forensic accountant and a certified fraud examiner, and unlike you, I do not rely on empty intimidation tactics or forged signatures to win an argument. I rely entirely on federal statutes and mathematically verified transaction ledgers." I unclasped the heavy brass locks of the briefcase and flipped the lid open. The sound was incredibly loud in the dead quiet of the mansion. I pulled out a thick stack of documents bound together by heavy black clips and dropped them directly in front of him. My father, Gerald, leaned forward in his velvet armchair, his breathing shallow and rapid. My mother, Vivian, watched me with wide, terrified eyes, completely unable to comprehend the massive shift in the power dynamic. Chloe's mocking smile began to slowly fade, replaced by a creeping sense of genuine unease. She had never seen me operate in my professional capacity. She had only ever known the quiet, obedient sister she could easily manipulate. Mr. Harrison glanced down at the documents, but refused to pick them up, maintaining his stubborn facade. "You can print out all the spreadsheets you want," he scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "It changes absolutely nothing about the legal reality of this situation. I already told your parents the undeniable facts." Marcus signed the authorization forms. Marcus executed the smart contracts. He moved the money. My client is legally shielded by his administrative signatures. If you try to pursue this, the only person going to prison is your brother. I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the sharp, terrifying smile of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. "You are absolutely right about one thing, Mr. Harrison," I said, tapping my manicured fingernail against the top page of the file. "Marcus did sign the authorization forms. He blindly signed every single document Chloe put in front of him because he is a gullible fool who trusts his wife. The digital signatures on the cryptocurrency transfers do in fact belong to him. In a standard case of corporate embezzlement, your defense strategy would be absolutely flawless. You could easily pin the missing $200,000 entirely on his incompetence, and Chloe could walk away completely untouched. I paused deliberately, letting him savor his false victory for just one more second. Then I pulled the rug completely out from under his expensive leather shoes. However, I continued, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet pitch. "You and your client made one incredibly fatal error when you were setting up this little financial heist. You got greedy. You did not just take the $200,000 from my parents' second mortgage. You decided you wanted to extract even more capital before you burned the company to the ground." I reached into the file and pulled out a brightly colored official government document, placing it right on top of the stack. The seal of the United States federal government was stamped clearly at the top of the page. Mr. Harrison finally looked down. The moment his eyes registered the official federal seal, his arrogant posture stiffened. The blood began to slowly drain from his face. 6 weeks ago, I explained my words striking like physical blows in the silent room. Chloe applied for a massive business development grant, but she did not apply for just any standard commercial loan. She specifically targeted a highly competitive minority business grant funded directly by the federal government. These specific taxpayer funds are exclusively reserved to support Black entrepreneurs and historically marginalized communities attempting to build businesses in the technology sector. I looked directly at Chloe. She was completely frozen, her eyes wide with mounting terror as the devastating reality of my words washed over her. Chloe is a white woman, I stated plainly, letting the undeniable fact echo through the room. She has absolutely zero legal right to claim a single penny of those minority-designated funds. But she knew that Marcus, being a Black man, was the perfect demographic profile to secure the cash. So she used his identity. She filed the massive grant application using his name, his racial background, and his fake artificial intelligence company as a fraudulent front. The federal government approved the application and deposited an additional $50,000 directly into the temporary holding account Chloe had set up. Mr. Harrison swallowed hard. The absolute confidence he had walked in with was rapidly evaporating. He was a smart lawyer. He knew exactly where this was going, and he knew how incredibly dangerous the territory had just become. The problem, Mr. Harrison, I continued, leaning slightly across the glass table to close the physical distance between us, is that Chloe did not separate the funds. When she executed her grand exit strategy last week, she bundled the $50,000 of federal grant money together with the $200,000 of my parents' stolen mortgage equity. She converted the entire bundled amount into cryptocurrency and wired it directly to her brother's offshore account in the Cayman Islands. I tapped the federal document once more, my eyes locked in a fierce, unwavering battle of wits with the lawyer. If this were just a simple marital dispute over a second mortgage, you could easily hide behind Marcus's signatures and claim ignorance, I said, my voice radiating absolute authority. But the second your client intentionally falsified a federal application, stole minority taxpayer funds, and wired government money across international borders, this ceased to be a simple family matter. Your client did not just defraud my gullible parents. She actively defrauded the United States government. The silence in the mansion was absolute. Even my parents had stopped breathing, completely stunned by the sheer magnitude of the crimes I was laying out on the coffee table. Mr. Harrison took a step back from the documents as if they were physically burning him. His mind was racing frantically, trying to find a legal loophole, a technicality, an escape route. But there was none. I was a forensic accountant, and I had built an absolutely airtight, ironclad cage around his client. He realized in that exact moment that Chloe had lied to him. She had not told him about the federal minority grant. She had hired him thinking he could bully a frightened, wealthy family into submission, but she had unknowingly walked him straight into the crosshairs of a massive federal indictment. You cannot prove she initiated the transfers. Mr. Harrison stammered, his voice completely losing its smooth, polished edge. The signatures belong to Marcus. I have the IP address logs from the internet service provider. I shot back instantly, shutting down his weak defense. The digital transactions were executed from Chloe's personal laptop, while Marcus was physically across town, having lunch with a potential investor. I also have the encrypted messages between Chloe and her brother discussing the offshore account routing numbers. It is all documented right here in this file, a file that I have already officially handed over to the authorities. Chloe let out a sharp, terrified gasp. She stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the edge of the Persian rug. She looked at her lawyer, her eyes pleading for him to fix it, pleading for him to use his arrogant magic to make the nightmare go away. But Mr. Harrison was already violently packing his leather folio. He was a shark, and sharks do not stick around when the water gets poisoned. He was already planning how to sever his legal representation and distance himself from her radioactive federal crimes. I stood up straight, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored jacket with perfect calm. I looked directly at the woman who had spent the last 3 weeks trying to destroy my family and steal my parents' home. The smug white tears she had weaponized against my brother would be absolutely useless where she was going. "Mr. Lawyer," I said, my voice ringing with the cold, hard strike of absolute justice. "Defrauding the federal government carries a 20-year sentence. The FBI agents are waiting for her outside." Chloe turned completely pale. As if perfectly cued by my words, the heavy mahogany front doors of the mansion swung open. Two tall men and one woman, wearing dark navy windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI printed boldly across their backs, stepped directly into the grand foyer. The static crackle of a police radio broke the suffocating silence of the room. Their sudden imposing presence instantly sucked whatever remaining oxygen was left in the house. They did not knock, and they certainly did not ask for permission to enter. Chloe turned completely pale, her pristine white designer suit suddenly looking more like a surrender flag. She stumbled backward, her designer heels catching awkwardly on the edge of the expensive Persian rug. She looked wildly at her high-powered lawyer, desperately expecting him to step in and deploy his aggressive legal magic to shield her from the federal agents. But Mr. Harrison was a seasoned survivalist in the legal world. The moment he saw the federal windbreakers, he practically sprinted away from her side. He aggressively snapped his leather folio shut and took 3 massive steps backward, putting as much physical distance between himself and Chloe as humanly possible. "Agents," Mr. Harrison said, his voice remarkably steady despite the chaotic turn of events. "I am formally withdrawing as legal counsel for this individual effective immediately. I was retained under entirely false pretenses regarding a simple domestic dispute and a standard real estate contract. I have absolutely no involvement in any federal grant applications or international wire fraud." He did not even look back at Chloe as he marched past the federal agents and walked straight out the front door, leaving his former client completely defenseless and utterly exposed. Chloe began to hyperventilate. Her chest heaved, and she immediately tried to deploy her absolute favorite weapon. She forced her eyes to well up with tears, and she let out a pathetic, trembling sob. She looked at the female federal agent, attempting to play the terrified, fragile victim one last time. "Please, you have to understand," Chloe cried, her voice shaking with manufactured terror. "My husband forced me to do it. Marcus is a violent man. He made me sign those papers. He made me transfer the money. I was just trying to survive his abuse. Please, you have to believe me." The female FBI agent did not offer a warm blanket or a sympathetic ear. She simply pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from her utility belt and stepped forward. "Save the performance for the federal judge, ma'am," the agent said, her voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. "We have the internet service provider logs tracing the transactions directly to your personal devices. We have the encrypted messages to your brother in the Cayman Islands. And local police have already reviewed the security footage from the hallway outside your apartment, proving you staged the domestic violence incident entirely by yourself. Turn around and place your hands securely behind your back." Chloe let out a genuine piercing shriek as the cold steel cuffs locked tightly around her wrists. The sound of the metal ratcheting closed echoed sharply through the luxurious living room. She was no longer the arrogant mastermind who thought she had successfully stolen a family fortune. She was just another white-collar criminal being marched out of a wealthy suburban neighborhood in broad daylight. The 2 male agents gripped her arms firmly and escorted her out the front door, completely ignoring her frantic, hysterical sobbing. The female agent lingered for a brief moment. She turned toward the open doorway and gave a short nod. Walking slowly into the house right behind the departing federal agents was my brother, Marcus. Because I had submitted the comprehensive evidence file, clearing him of both the fraudulent business activities and the fabricated domestic violence charges, the authorities had immediately processed his release from the county jail. He was still wearing the wrinkled, expensive suit he had been arrested in, but he looked absolutely destroyed. His broad shoulders were slumped, his head hung incredibly low, and his eyes were red and swollen. Marcus walked into the center of the living room and simply collapsed. He dropped heavily to his knees right on the Persian rug and broke down crying. It was not a quiet, dignified cry. It was the loud, ugly, gut-wrenching sobbing of a man who had just realized his entire existence was a carefully constructed lie. He had lost his fake business, he had lost his beautiful wife, and he had almost lost 20 years of his life to a federal penitentiary, all because he was too arrogant and too incompetent to read the documents he was signing. If this were a cinematic documentary, this is exactly where the camera blocking would shift to a wide establishing shot of the entire living room. The visual framing would capture the complete and total shift in power dynamics. Marcus was on his knees weeping on the floor. My father Gerald and my mother Vivian were standing near the velvet armchair looking entirely disheveled and emotionally exhausted. And standing perfectly still in the center of the room, completely unbothered by the chaos surrounding me, was me. I owned the room. I was the absolute center of gravity in the mansion. My parents rushed forward to comfort their golden child. Vivian dropped to her knees, wrapping her arms fiercely around Marcus's shaking shoulders. Gerald placed a heavy hand on his son's back, letting out a massive, shuddering sigh of relief. For a few long moments, the only sounds in the grand room were Marcus's heavy sobs and my mother's quiet, soothing whispers. But the humility did not last. It never does with highly narcissistic people. The moment my parents realized that the threat of federal prison was officially gone and the evil daughter-in-law had been removed from their home, their entire psychological posture shifted. The terrifying crisis had been miraculously averted. They had survived the hurricane, and because I was the one standing there with the open briefcase, they completely convinced themselves that I had executed this brilliant takedown specifically to save them. Gerald slowly stood up from the floor. He took a deep breath and smoothed his hands over his wrinkled designer shirt, trying to physically brush off the humiliation of the last hour. He cleared his throat and his spine stiffened. The arrogant, commanding tone that he had used at my birthday dinner instantly returned. "Well," Gerald said, looking directly at me with a profound lack of gratitude, "you certainly took your sweet time putting an end to this ridiculous nonsense, Nia. You could have warned us about the federal investigation before the bank locked our accounts and embarrassed us in front of the country club." Vivian stood up right next to him, wiping a stray tear from her cheek. Her face hardened instantly as she looked at me. She crossed her arms defensively, completely reverting to her classic demanding nature. "Your father is absolutely right," Vivian chimed in, her voice dripping with that familiar toxic condescension. "If you had just given your brother the $80,000 at your birthday party, none of this would have ever happened. He would not have had to rely on that awful, manipulative white woman for funding. But at least you finally remembered your place and did the right thing for your family." I stood completely still, letting my hands rest lightly on the edge of the glass coffee table. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of their words was almost majestic. I had just dismantled an international wire fraud ring, saved their son from a massive federal indictment, and completely neutralized the woman who stole their home equity. And they were actually standing in their foreclosed living room blaming me for the entire situation. They truly believed I was just their obedient guard dog who had successfully chased away a burglar and was now waiting patiently for a pat on the head. Gerald pointed a commanding finger toward the grand entryway. "Now that that nasty woman is gone, we have a massive amount of work to do." Gerald barked, his voice echoing with absolute entitlement. The bank taped a deeply humiliating neon yellow foreclosure notice directly to my front door. "The neighbors have likely already seen it. I need you to go out there and rip it down immediately. Then I need you to log into your accounting firm portal and wire the past due mortgage balance to the bank right now. We have country club membership dues coming up next week, and I expect you to make the necessary calls to get my retirement accounts unfrozen by tomorrow morning." Vivian nodded in complete agreement. "And you need to pay for a professional cleaning service to come deal with Marcus's apartment," she added casually, waving her manicured hand in the air. "That girl destroyed his kitchen before the police arrived. You need to handle the damages so he can move back in peacefully." The wide camera shot would hold steady, capturing the three of them standing together. Marcus sniffing quietly on the floor while Gerald and Vivian confidently issued their financial demands, expecting me to simply pull out my checkbook and restore their fake royal empire. I did not scream. I did not laugh. I simply reached into the leather briefcase one final time. I bypassed the thick stacks of banking evidence and pulled out a single crisp legal document printed on heavy premium paper. I looked at my father. I looked at my mother. And then, I let a slow, incredibly cold smirk spread across my face. I think there has been a massive misunderstanding about my presence here today, I said, my voice perfectly calm and razor sharp. I held the document up, letting the afternoon shadows fall across the bold legal text printed at the top of the page. Who said I came here to save this house? My father stared at the document in my hand. He blinked several times as if his brain was completely refusing to process the English language. The arrogant, commanding posture he had just forcefully reconstructed began to rapidly dissolve all over again. He looked from the crisp, premium paper to my face and then back to the paper. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh, confused whisper. "What do you mean you did not come here to save the house?" If a director were framing this exact moment, the camera would shift into a tight profile shot of my face. The harsh afternoon light filtering through the narrow gaps in the heavy velvet curtains would hit my side profile perfectly. The lighting would cast deep shadows across the room while accentuating the sharp, ruthless features I had inherited from the very man standing in front of me. I did not look like a frightened daughter. I looked like a seasoned corporate predator who had just successfully cornered her prey. I stepped forward and placed the heavy legal document directly onto the glass coffee table, right next to the massive stack of FBI evidence. "I did not wire a single penny of my personal money to your bank account," I explained, my voice perfectly steady and unyielding. "I did not make any frantic phone calls to the branch manager to beg for your financial salvation. Because your bank no longer owns the primary debt on this residential property." My father reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the document. His eyes scanned the bold text at the top of the page. I watched his lips move slightly as he silently read the complex legal jargon. He was reading a formal assignment of mortgage and transfer of lien. When the federal algorithms flagged your entire financial portfolio for international wire fraud, your massive second mortgage instantly became a highly toxic asset. I continued lecturing them with the cold precision of a college professor. Traditional banking institutions absolutely despise holding toxic assets on their balance sheets. They especially hate holding debt that is directly tied to an active federal investigation involving stolen taxpayer funds. The bank wanted this property completely off their books as quickly as humanly possible. They were actively preparing to auction your home off to the lowest corporate bidder by the end of the month, just to cut their massive losses. My mother, Vivian, let out a small, confused gasp. She took a tentative step forward, her eyes darting between me and the paper trembling in my father's hands. "But the foreclosure notice is on the door," she stammered desperately, trying to make sense of the financial terminology. "If the bank does not own the house anymore, then who is foreclosing on us?" I turned my piercing gaze to my mother. "My wealth management firm specializes in acquiring distressed high-value real estate assets," I explained carefully, articulating every single syllable so there could be absolutely no misunderstanding. "As a senior partner at the firm, I have absolute discretionary authority over our acquisition portfolio. When I saw that the bank was preparing to liquidate this estate, I made them a highly lucrative corporate offer. My firm officially purchased your entire defaulted debt at a massive discount. We bought the lien, we bought the mortgage, we bought every single financial obligation attached to this specific address." For a brief, fleeting moment, my mother's face completely lit up. Her mind violently twisted the devastating facts to fit her preferred narrative. She genuinely thought I had orchestrated this massive corporate buyout as an act of profound familial loyalty. "Oh, Nia!" Vivian gasped, her hands flying to her mouth in a gesture of profound relief. "You bought the house to keep it in the family. You protected our legacy. I knew you would not let us fall. I knew you would step up for your brother and for us. Thank you. Thank you so much." She actually took a step forward and reached her arms out, expecting to pull me into a warm, tearful embrace. She expected everything to go right back to normal. She expected to wake up tomorrow morning in her massive master bedroom, drink expensive coffee, and go back to pretending she was the wealthy queen of the local country club. I took one deliberate step backward, entirely rejecting her physical affection. I let my hands fall gracefully to my sides. I did not buy this house to keep it in the family, Mom. I stated, my voice striking the room like a physical blow. Her arms dropped to her sides, and her smile instantly vanished. I bought this house because it is a prime piece of real estate located in a highly desirable, affluent neighborhood. Acquiring this property at a distressed discount makes perfect financial sense for my corporate investment portfolio. You are completely confusing a cold business transaction with an act of familial love. My father, Gerald, finally snapped. The terrifying reality of the document in his hands fully registered in his arrogant mind. He violently threw the crisp paper back onto the glass coffee table. His face turned a deep, furious shade of red, and the veins in his neck began to bulge. "You cannot do this to me!" Gerald roared, his deep voice echoing violently off the high ceilings. "This is my house. I built this legacy. I bought this land. You are my daughter. You cannot just swoop in wearing a fancy suit and steal my property from out under me. I will fight you. I will call my lawyers, and I will tie you up in civil court for the next 10 years. I leaned forward, resting my palms flat against the smooth glass of the coffee table. I looked up at him, completely unfazed by his loud, aggressive posturing. "You do not have any lawyers, Dad," I reminded him, my tone dripping with absolute icy reality. "You do not have a legal team because your entire financial portfolio is currently frozen by the federal government. You do not have a single dollar of liquid cash to pay a retainer fee. And even if you miraculously found a lawyer willing to work for free, they would tell you exactly what I am telling you right now. I did not steal anything. I executed a perfectly legal corporate acquisition." I paused, letting my words sink deeply into his panicking brain before delivering the ultimate reality check. "And let us be entirely clear about the reality of your precious legacy." I continued, my voice rising just enough to dominate the massive room. "You do not own this house. You have not truly owned this house for years. You mortgaged it to the absolute hilt to fund luxury leased cars, expensive country club memberships, and a fake technology startup for a son who cannot even read a basic legally binding contract. You traded your actual ownership for the pathetic illusion of wealth. You built a house of cards, and Chloe was simply the wind that knocked it all down." Marcus let out a quiet, miserable groan from his place on the floor. He pulled his knees to his chest, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his own incompetence. He finally understood that he was the weapon Chloe had used to destroy his own parents, and he understood that his older sister was the absolute titan who now owned the wreckage. My father stood frozen, his chest heaving as the absolute truth of my words stripped away the final remnants of his pride. He had spent his entire adult life projecting strength and financial dominance over everyone around him. He had constantly belittled my career as a forensic accountant, mocking me for tracking pennies while he supposedly built an empire. Now, the very career he had relentlessly mocked was the exact mechanism that had completely consumed him. 3 weeks ago, I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, terrifying register. 3 weeks ago, you stood in front of 50 of your wealthy, powerful friends, and you tried to publicly humiliate me into submission. You slapped a blank check next to my birthday cake. You demanded I pay $80,000 to stay in your good graces. You told me to pack my bags, walk out the front door, and stop calling you my parents, all because I refused to function as your personal automated teller machine. I stood up straight, looking down at my family. The wide establishing shot would show them completely diminished, stripped of their fake royalty, and entirely at my mercy. "You threw me away over $80,000, I said, the absolute irony of the situation hanging heavy in the dead air. "Now I am standing right in front of you, but I am not your obedient daughter anymore. I am the senior partner of the corporate entity that holds the exclusive legal rights to the roof over your head. You kicked me out over $80,000. And now I am your sole legal creditor, holding the financial lifeblood of your entire bloodline in the palm of my hand." The camera would immediately break away from my static profile and begin to frantically track the erratic, chaotic movements of my parents. The lens would pan sharply to catch my father Gerald stumbling backward, as if the physical weight of my words had literally knocked the wind out of his lungs. He bumped heavily into the velvet armchair, his perfectly polished shoes slipping slightly on the expensive Persian rug. He looked down at the legal document resting on the glass coffee table and then up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of absolute horror and boiling rage. The camera would then whip over to my mother Vivian, who was physically shaking. She raised her trembling hands to her face, her diamond rings catching the dim afternoon light as a fresh wave of panicked tears began to stream down her perfectly made-up face. For 32 years, my parents had maintained absolute control over the family dynamic through financial manipulation and emotional intimidation. They had always been the towering authoritative figures, dictating the rules and dispensing punishments whenever I stepped out of line. But in this singular defining moment, the entire power structure of our family completely inverted. They were suddenly standing inside a house they no longer owned, looking at a daughter they could no longer control. And because narcissistic people cannot handle the sudden loss of power, they immediately resorted to the only defense mechanism they had left. They tried to aggressively gaslight me. "You are a monster!" Vivian shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly through the grand living room. She lunged forward, pointing a shaking manicured finger directly at my chest. The camera would push in tightly on her tear-streaked face, capturing the desperate, frantic energy radiating from her entire body. "You are going to throw your own parents out on the street. We gave you life. We put a roof over your head when you were a child, and this is how you repay us. You are going to evict us from our own home just to prove a point. You are sick, Nia. You are completely sick in the head." My father instantly joined the assault, feeding off her hysterical energy to rebuild his own shattered ego. He pushed himself off the velvet armchair and took an aggressive step toward me, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me just like he had always done. "You think you are so smart?" Gerald roared, his face turning a deep, angry shade of purple. "You think you can just walk in here with your corporate paperwork and destroy this family without any consequences? You are completely delusional. We built this community. We are respected members of the elite. When people find out what you have done, they will be absolutely disgusted. The whole community will spit on you. You will be completely exiled from every social circle in Atlanta. No one will ever do business with you again when they hear that you threw your own flesh and blood onto the pavement to secure a real estate deal." I stood completely unfazed. I did not step back. I did not cross my arms defensively. I simply let their frantic, desperate screams wash over me like a light summer rain. I looked at the two of them, watching them flail wildly in the deep end of a pool they had entirely dug for themselves. The camera would slowly pull back to frame the three of us, capturing the stark contrast between their chaotic emotional meltdown and my absolute stone-cold composure. I waited for my father to stop yelling. I waited for him to run out of breath. When the grand living room finally fell silent, except for the pathetic sound of Marcus quietly weeping on the floor, I delivered the reality check that completely crushed whatever was left of their fragile egos. "The community you are so desperately worried about does not care about you, Dad," I said, my voice perfectly calm, level, and utterly merciless. "They do not respect you. They only respect the massive mansion you live in and the luxury cars you lease. And once the federal banking authorities formally release the details of your frozen accounts and Marcus's fake technology company, that entire community will drop you instantly. They will not spit on me. They will spit on you for being foolish enough to let a white woman steal $200,000 of your home equity right under your nose." My father opened his mouth to argue, but I immediately cut him off, my voice rising with sharp, undeniable authority. "Do not stand there and talk to me about family loyalty," I commanded, stepping forward and forcing him to physically retreat. "Do not dare lecture me about treating my own flesh and blood with respect. You lost the right to use that argument exactly 3 weeks ago." I turned to my mother, locking my eyes directly onto hers. She flinched under my intense gaze, suddenly looking incredibly small and frail. Let us take a walk down memory lane, Mom. I continued, my words slicing through the heavy air. Let us rewind to the night of my 32nd birthday. You invited 50 of your most influential friends into this very house. 50 federal judges, surgeons, and real estate developers. You invited them here not to celebrate my achievements, but to use them as an audience for a public execution. You brought me to the head of that dining table, and you intentionally tried to humiliate me. I took another step forward, dominating the physical space between us. You slid a blank check across the table, Gerald, I said, pointing directly at my father. You looked me dead in the eye and you tried to extort me. You told me to pay $80,000 to fund a company that did not even legally exist. You told me that if I did not hand over my hard-earned money, I was to pack my bags, walk out the front door, and stop calling you my parents. You publicly disowned me over $80,000. My father swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the floor. The aggressive fire in his chest was rapidly burning out, replaced by the crushing weight of his own documented hypocrisy. And you, Vivian, I said, turning my attention back to my mother. You did not say a word to defend your daughter. You did not tell your husband to stop. Instead, you leaned over my birthday cake, you looked at me with absolute pure hatred, and you blew out my candles yourself. You completely erased my presence in this family because I refused to be a financial stepping stone for your golden boy. I gestured casually toward Marcus, who was still curled up on the Persian rug, completely useless and unable to defend his parents. You treated me like a worthless business transaction, I stated plainly, letting the undeniable truth echo through the massive room. You decided that my only value to this family was the available balance in my checking account. You demanded that I operate like a corporate entity, sacrificing my own assets to bail out your repeated failures. You made the rules that night. You set the exact terms of our relationship in front of 50 witnesses. The camera would focus tightly on my face, capturing the absolute lack of sympathy in my eyes. The emotional manipulation they were trying to deploy was completely bouncing off my armor. I felt no guilt. I felt no remorse. I was simply executing the final phase of an audit they had unknowingly demanded. So please do not stand in my living room and cry about being thrown out on the street. I concluded, my voice dropping to a sharp, chilling whisper that commanded absolute attention. Do not act like you are the victims of some cruel, unnatural betrayal. I am not destroying this family. This family destroyed itself the moment you handed the keys to Chloe and decided I was expendable. My parents stood frozen, completely stripped of their arrogant illusions. The massive house around them felt entirely hollow. They had no money. They had no legal recourse. They had absolutely no leverage left to pull. They were completely at the mercy of the daughter they had spent a lifetime treating like garbage. I looked down at the formal assignment of mortgage resting on the glass coffee table, and then I looked back up at the two people who used to be my parents. I let a cold, satisfied smirk touch the corners of my mouth. I am just doing exactly what you taught me at my birthday party, I said, delivering the final devastating blow, handling assets strictly by the books, with no exceptions for freeloaders. I did not wait for my parents to process the utter destruction of their worldview. I reached into the sleek leather interior of my briefcase one final time. My fingers brushed past the thick folders of federal evidence and pulled out a single brightly colored piece of paper. If the documentary camera were still rolling, it would immediately cut to an extreme close-up shot of this exact moment. The lens would focus entirely on the crisp, neon yellow document as I placed it firmly onto the glass coffee table, right next to the assignment of mortgage. The bold black letters printed across the top of the page would fill the entire frame. Formal notice of eviction and order to vacate. You have exactly 72 hours, I announced, my voice echoing with absolute legal authority in the silent living room. My mother, Vivian, let out a strangled gasp, as if the words themselves were physically choking her. 72 hours, she repeated, her voice a fragile, terrified whisper. Nia, you cannot be serious. We have lived in this house for 2 decades. We have entire rooms filled with our lives. We cannot possibly pack up our entire existence in 3 days. Where are we supposed to go? That is absolutely not my problem, Mom, I replied, my tone completely devoid of any familial warmth. You are no longer the owners of this property. You are now classified as unauthorized tenants, occupying a corporate asset without a valid lease agreement. By law, my firm could have local sheriffs forcefully remove you from the premises this very afternoon. Giving you 3 days to pack your personal belongings is a professional courtesy. It is the absolute maximum amount of grace you are going to get from me. I pointed a manicured finger down at the yellow document, making sure my father Gerald was listening to every single word. And let me be perfectly clear about what you are allowed to take with you. I continued, locking eyes with the broken man who used to terrorize me. You may pack your clothing, your personal photographs, and your basic everyday essentials. You are absolutely forbidden from removing any high-value assets from this estate. You will not take the imported crystal chandeliers. You will not strip the luxury appliances from the kitchen. You will not load the expensive antique furniture into a moving truck. Every single piece of valuable property inside these walls now legally belongs to my firm to offset the massive financial debt you defaulted on. My father looked at me with hollow, dead eyes. The furious fighting spirit he had displayed just minutes ago was entirely extinguished. He was a hollow shell of the arrogant patriarch he had pretended to be his entire life. He slowly sank deeper into the velvet armchair, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his absolute failure. I turned my attention away from my parents and looked down at Marcus. My brother was still sitting on the expensive Persian rug, clutching his knees to his chest. He looked up at me with red, swollen eyes, his face streaked with tears and snot. The golden child was completely broken. The arrogant tech entrepreneur persona he had worn like a cheap costume had been completely violently ripped away. You should consider yourself incredibly lucky, Marcus, I said, staring down at him with cold clinical precision. The federal authorities have the comprehensive evidence file I provided. Because I gave them the internet service provider logs and the encrypted messages proving Chloe was the mastermind, they are not going to charge you with federal wire fraud. You are not going to spend the next 20 years in a maximum security penitentiary. Marcus let out a massive, shuddering breath, dropping his head back down to his knees in profound relief. But I was not finished delivering his verdict. Do not celebrate yet, I warned him, my voice slicing through his momentary relief. You are not walking away from this clean. You willingly signed legally binding financial authorizations without reading a single word. You allowed yourself to be used as a fraudulent corporate front. The federal prosecutors are going to formally charge you with gross corporate negligence and financial misconduct. You are looking at a minimum of 5 years of strict legal probation. You will have a permanent criminal record. You will never be approved for a corporate loan. You will never hold a corporate executive position, and you will never play the role of the brilliant businessman ever again. Your professional life is completely over. Marcus let out a pathetic, whimpering sound, completely crushed under the weight of his ruined future. He had spent his entire life being bailed out by the women around him, but this time the consequences were permanent and inescapable. And as for your beloved wife, I continued ensuring my parents heard exactly what was going to happen to the woman they had chosen over me. Chloe's little performance is completely over. Weaponizing her white tears against a black man might work on local police officers responding to a domestic disturbance call, but it means absolutely nothing to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They do not care about her crying. They care about the $50,000 of minority taxpayer funds she illegally secured and wired to the Cayman Islands. She is going to face a federal judge, and she is going to serve hard time in a federal prison facility. The grand living room fell completely silent once again. The only sound was the heavy, ragged breathing of a family that had just been entirely dismantled. There were no more lies to tell. There were no more manipulative tactics to deploy. The grand illusion of the Wilson family legacy was officially dead and buried. My mother Vivian slowly slid off the edge of the plush sofa. She dropped to her knees right next to Marcus. Her perfect hair was a tangled mess, her expensive makeup was completely ruined by her frantic tears, and her designer dress was wrinkled. The wealthy, influential socialite was completely gone. In her place was a desperate, terrified woman, staring down the barrel of absolute poverty. "Nia, please," she begged, pressing her hands together in a pathetic gesture of prayer. "Please do not do this. We have no liquid cash." The bank froze everything. "We cannot even afford to rent a hotel room. We will have to move into a cheap apartment on the east side of the city. We will be completely humiliated. Our friends from the country club will see us. They will know we lost everything. Please, I am begging you. Do not take our dignity." I looked down at the woman who had birthed me. I looked at the woman who had stood silently while my father extorted me at my birthday party. I looked at the woman who had leaned over my birthday cake and blown out my candles with pure, unadulterated malice. "You lost your dignity the moment you decided I was nothing but a human bank account, Mom." I replied, my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of mercy. "You chose to value the opinions of your wealthy friends over the well-being of your own daughter. Now you get to experience exactly what it feels like to be completely discarded." I did not wait for her to respond. I simply turned away from the pathetic scene unfolding on the Persian rug. I reached out and grabbed the handle of my heavy leather briefcase. I snapped the solid brass lock shut, the sharp metallic clicking sound, echoing with absolute finality through the grand mansion. "Remember," I said, my back turned to the three of them, as I faced the heavy mahogany front doors. "You have exactly 72 hours. When the clock strikes 4 on Friday afternoon, the security team from my firm will arrive to change the locks. If you are still inside this property at that exact moment, you will be removed by force in front of the entire neighborhood. I highly suggest you start packing." I did not wait for their responses. I did not want to hear another pathetic apology or another frantic, desperate plea. I had delivered absolute cold, hard justice, and my work in this house was completely done. I walked confidently toward the grand entryway, my heels clicking sharply and rhythmically against the polished marble floor. I reached out and grabbed the heavy brass handle of the front door, pulling it open to reveal the bright, warm afternoon sunlight waiting outside. Behind me, the grand mansion was completely filled with the sounds of absolute despair. I could hear my mother openly weeping loudly, her wails bouncing off the high ceilings. I could hear Marcus sobbing into his hands. I could hear the heavy, deafening silence of a patriarch who had completely lost his entire empire. The elite facade had been completely stripped bare, leaving nothing but the toxic rot that had always existed beneath the surface. I stepped out onto the front porch and pulled the heavy door shut behind me. The solid wooden door slammed firmly into the frame, completely cutting off the sounds of their misery. I walked down the long, manicured pathway toward my car, the warm sun hitting my face. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I felt completely light. I felt absolutely free. I walked to my car, unlocked the doors, and drove away from the wreckage of my toxic family without taking a single backward glance. The documentary camera would slowly pull back right now, transitioning away from the bright afternoon sun of that day and returning to the cool, low-key lighting of the present moment. I am sitting exactly where I started this story, safe inside my downtown penthouse. I lift the heavy crystal tumbler to my lips and take the very last sip of my aged bourbon. Outside my window, the amber streetlights of Atlanta reflect softly through the horizontal blinds, casting long, quiet shadows across my home office. True to my word, exactly 72 hours after I delivered that eviction notice, my private security team arrived at the mansion and changed every single lock. My parents were forced to pack whatever clothes and basic necessities they could fit into the back of a cheap rented moving van. Today, Gerald and Vivian live in a cramped, outdated two-bedroom apartment on the exact side of town they spent their entire lives actively mocking. They have no country club memberships, no leased luxury vehicles, and absolutely no elite friends. The wealthy community they tried so desperately to impress completely turned their backs on them the very second the truth about the foreclosure and the federal investigation became public gossip. They became the ultimate cautionary tale of the neighborhood. Their fake generational legacy is completely dead. Marcus is currently serving his 5 years of strict federal probation. He works a minimum wage retail job because no legitimate corporate entity will ever allow him near their financial documents again. And Chloe is sitting in a federal penitentiary, finally learning the hard way that her manipulative tears hold absolutely no currency behind heavy steel bars. I set my empty glass down on the polished oak desk. I feel no guilt. I feel absolutely no regret. I cut the toxic anchor from my life, and I have never been more successful or more at peace. I look directly into the camera lens, making absolute unwavering eye contact with every single person watching this. People love to preach that blood is thicker than water. True. But when your family treats you like an ATM, a property deed is the only thing that stops you from bleeding out. Always own your financial truth.